My name is Rachel Owen. My name is Rachel Owen, and I am here today from the Science Policy Office at the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America. I'm going to be moderating our session today, and in a few moments, I'll introduce you to Dr. Jourdan Bell, an extension specialist at Texas A&M University, and she's going to be the inaugural speaker for the 2022 NCFAR Virtual Lunch and Learn series. The National Coalition for Food and Agricultural Research, or NCFAR, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, consensus-based, and customer-led coalition that brings together food, agriculture, nutrition, conservation, and natural resource stakeholders to serve as a forum and unified voice supporting increased federal investment in USDA research, education, and economics, or the REE mission. NCFAR brings together entities representing research customers, or organizations that need and benefit from the USDA REE outcomes, with research and extension institutions, scientific societies, foundations, and other stakeholders. The important work of NCFAR is incredibly important to agronomy, crops, and soil science researchers across the country, and we're thrilled to be partnering with NCFAR on the Lunch and Learn today, focused on climate change in rural communities. Before we dive in, thank you to NCFAR's 2022 Lunch and Learn series sponsors, Eversole Associates, the Extension Committee on Organization and Policy, or ECOP, and the SOAR Foundation. You're invited to learn more about the 200 land grant programs that address aspects of climate education, including mitigation, resilience, and adaptation at the URL on this slide. It's now my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Jourdan Bell. Dr. Bell is an associate professor and extension specialist in the Department of Soil and Crop Sciences at Texas A&M University in Amarillo, Texas. Dr. Bell's extension and research efforts focus on agronomic management to improve crop production and profitability on the Texas High Plains. Her extension activities include assisting county extension agents with demonstration trials, as well as compiling and presenting results for regional producers through trial reports and county programs. Her research portfolio focuses on crop selection and agronomic practices in sorghum, wheat, cotton, and corn systems on the Texas High Plains in the face of declining regional groundwater levels. Dr. Bell earned her PhD in soil science from Texas A&M University and an MS in plant, soil, and environmental science from West Texas A&M University. Dr. Bell is actively involved with the American Society of Agronomy, Crop Science Society of America, and Soil Science Society of America, as well as Women in Science Endeavors, or WISE. In today's talk, Dr. Bell will focus on the impact of climate change on agricultural production in rural communities. Throughout her presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat box. We'll hold questions towards the end. Also, as another housekeeping note, we are recording this session, and we'll share a slide at the end with the URL where you can go to find the recording. With that, I will turn it over to Dr. Bell to dive in.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity. I'm going to make sure I get my slides pulled up real fast. Okay, we are now in presentation mode. Thank you so much for the introduction and the ability to present today. As the introduction, as Rachel said, I am going to be talking about the impact of climate change on agricultural production and rural communities. And of course, as I looked at different levels of information for this presentation, it really became very broad. And so I'm really going to focus on the region of the Southern Great Plains first and foremost. That is because that is where I am located with Texas A&M AgriLife. I am at a regional extension office in Amarillo, Texas. But also, we are really at a crossroad in this region as we look at the impact of climate change, as well as just our water level and the impact on crop production in this region. But I really do believe for us to have a thorough understanding of what's happened, we need to have a better understanding of the historical nature of today's situation. So I am going to briefly talk about just the history of agriculture in this region to bring us forward so that we have a perspective of what has happened and how we can adapt. And then also touch on some current research that we are conducting to reduce the impacts of climate on production agriculture. I do want to point out that this is a picture that I took in north of Amarillo, Texas, just several weeks ago. And this was a dust storm moving in as we were harvesting wheat silage. And so as we talk about the impact of climate in this region, it is very real. And so I really do think that this picture really accentuates what producers in the Southern Great Plains are facing on a daily basis. Of course, when we talk about climate change in rural America, this is something that's not just isolated to the Southern Great Plains. This is all of the U.S. We are discussing intensifying droughts, wildfires, temperature extremes, floods, hail, as well as hurricanes in coastal regions. And then even in our mountain regions, reduced winter snowpack and how that also impacts our stream flows into other regions of the U.S. And because of these extremes, producers are putting greater pressure on aquifers. Throughout the 20th century, our aquifers have allowed producers to mitigate just natural variations in climate because they were able to supplement those crop water demands with the aquifer. But because of intensifying climate, because of the intensifying climate, they are now putting those additional demands on the aquifers. And in many cases, our aquifers are no longer at levels that are able to meet the crop water demand. And in many cases, they're no longer a viable water source for our rural communities as well. And of course, we know that daily, it doesn't matter where we turn to in popular press, there is an article about the impact of climate on crop production. And in many ways, our recent global events have brought this to the forefront when we look at political instability as well as issues with market stability and transportation due to COVID. We see that we are in a very fragile system. And we know that agriculture really is fragile and that it can be impacted directly by climate as well as political instability. So it is very important that we consider the impact of climate on not just agriculture, but how this affects rural America as a whole. Now, of course, when we look at the U.S., a great percentage of our land is in farmland. But as I mentioned, I'm going to focus on the Southern Great Plains. And as we look at the Great Plains as a whole, the majority of the land in the Great Plains region is under farmland. But when we talk about the focus of the Southern Great Plains, this is definitely a very intense agricultural region. And we have challenges facing this region beyond just climate change, and climate change is exacerbating the challenges that we do face. We do have an agricultural economy. And as I mentioned, when we talk about the political instability as well as issues with COVID and market and transportation issues, we know how fragile the agricultural economy can be. Also, our primary water source is the Ogallala Aquifer, and I will talk about that in more detail later, but that is a declining water source. And so because of the limited irrigation that restricts our forage production as for livestock operations in addition to crop productivity. And then as we look at the Ogallala Aquifer and our inability to irrigate, we see producers refocusing their attention on rain-fed or dryland management. And as we look at dryland management, we know that the economic risks associated with crop production are elevated under those systems. And as a result, we have producers who have a greater dependence on federal crop insurance programs. And then in this region, in addition to having a declining aquifer level, we are seeing a very large growth within our livestock industry. And so it really does become important for producers to evaluate how they can manage irrigation for crop production as well as the demands for this growing livestock industry. And as we look at the growing livestock industry, and it's primarily the dairy industry, we do see that we have a very high forage demand from that dairy industry. So there is projected displacement of our traditional crops to meet those forage demands. And that is also causing some challenges within the local agricultural systems. And in this region, we also see below average household incomes. And with that, we have poor health as well as food insecurity that do become problematic for this region. Also, this region is known as a food desert where we do have limited food access. And then coupling these challenges with climate change, we see that moving forward regionally, we're going to have some very significant challenges. And this was actually addressed in the recent National Climate Assessment. And focusing on the Southern Great Plains, specifically the states of Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas, the assessment looked at this diverse climate. Of course, across this region, it's natural to have episodic droughts. And we know that flooding can occur and hurricanes can occur, especially in the coastal regions. This region is known for severe storms with large hail and tornadoes. We also have blizzards, ice storms, relentless winds, heat waves, and drought. And as we look at how climate will impact ag and indirectly degrade infrastructure, we see that we have rural, municipal, and county budgets that will be unable to meet the future funding needs for infrastructure improvements. And this is because of reduced incomes. And so as we move forward, we see that it's not just an impact to the farm, but also the impact at the community level. Within this assessment, there were projections that were made how climate will change in this region. In this region, temperatures are projected to increase by 3.6 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit by the mid-21st century. And this is compared to 1976 to the 2005 period. Within the projections, they looked at a lower scenario as well as a higher scenario. In the lower scenario, as I mentioned, these are those lower temperature increases where they could see, or where we could see temperatures increase by 3.6 degrees. But this would result in an increase in the number of days exceeding 100 by anywhere from 20 to 40 days on average during the year. Under the higher scenario, we would see the number of days that exceed 100 increase by 60 to, in some cases, more than 100 degrees or 100 days in South Texas. And when we look at crop productivity, we know that heat does drive the crop water demand. And if we have below average precipitation, we have declining groundwater levels, we have reduced stream flows from rivers like the Rio Grande that supply the vegetable production in South Texas, we know that we are not going to meet the crop water demand, and thus we will have lower productivity. And that does impact food security. In some cases, there is a projection for increased winter precipitation, but decreased summer precipitation. And so when we look at, again, the period of crop growth and having decreased summer precipitation will directly impact the crop productivity. Increased temperatures will exacerbate the aridity, which is the drying of the soil due to increased evapotranspiration or the crop water demand caused by those higher temperatures. And then also increased precipitation intensity. And that is something that we are currently seeing in the Southern Great Plains. We have been in an extended drought, and although recently we have received rainfall, much of the rainfall has come in intense rainfall events, where we have received greater than 1 inch of rain in 15 minutes or less. And that results in greater runoff and less effective precipitation. Also, severe weather may become more frequent, more hailstorms, larger hailstorms, as well as high wind events. And so with this, we have increased crop loss and implications for the federal crop insurance program. In summary, they projected that there will be an impact to the quality of life in the region. The quality of life will be compromised, and the migration of individuals from rural to urban locations will impact agricultural markets, energy production, as well as demands on energy, as well as water resources. Agriculture is vulnerable to increasing temperatures, extreme precipitation, and as economies decline and infrastructure ages, the population will also shift because of those reasons to urban centers. And then in addition to the agricultural impact, there's the landscape scale ecological impacts that will result from climate change. There are also health threats. We have heat illnesses and diseases transmitted through food, water, and insects, and these will increase as temperatures rise. And then also weather conditions supporting these health threats are projected to be part of projected to be of longer duration or occur at times of the year when these threats are not normally experienced. These images or charts that I have over on the right are just an example of the landscape ecological impacts. This is from Texas Parks and Wildlife. And one thing that they have seen as temperatures have changed and water temperature has changed within the Gulf is a shift in fish species. And so in recent years, they've had greater gray snapper population and a decline in the southern flounder populations. So we do see these shifts and impacts beyond just the direct impact to agriculture. But as I mentioned, one of the impacts that we will see is a shift of populations or migration from agricultural counties. And although we have naturally seen that shift over the 20th century due to jobs, reduced opportunities in rural communities, we will see that exacerbated by climate change. This image actually does show the percent change in county populations from 2010 to 2020. And as we look at the percent change, the aqua color, or the counties that are in aqua, have a increase in population by 20% or more. And all of these counties in brown actually are showing a negative change, meaning that there is migration out of those counties. And of course, when we look at the Great Plains region as a whole, we are seeing that shift. And while we have people who are leaving to seek job opportunities, that also leaves a population that does not have opportunities in rural communities that put greater pressure on rural health systems as well as state infrastructure. So as I mentioned, why the Southern High Plains initially? Of course, I am located in the Southern High Plains, and this is a very agriculturally intense region. As we look at the production in this region, this is a feed and forage production region. We do grow feed grains, and we look at our corn production, it is feed corn. Although much of our wheat does go into the milling, we also have wheat that is consumed in the livestock industry as a feed wheat. Lots of grain sorghum, as well as wheat, corn, and sorghum forages. And these really do meet the livestock demands within the beef, dairy, and pork industries in this region. Also, this is a very large cotton fiber production region. And as I initially mentioned, this is a rural agricultural economy. This economy is very sensitive to climate change, and there are those socioeconomic implications beyond the farm income that will be implicated by climate change. Just looking at the concentration, I believe these USDA maps really do highlight the concentration of crop production in this Southern Great Plains region. This is the winter wheat production in 2021, and we can see that, really focused on that Southern Great Plain region, and also cotton production, again, really focused in the Southern Great Plain region. So these are key agricultural regions within the United States. And of course, currently we are in an extended drought, much of the Southern Great Plains as well as the Western US. Although when we talk about our current drought, we know that droughts are episodic. And as we look at the droughts over the last 22 years, we do see that there are natural cycles. But what we do not naturally take into account when we consider that drought is a natural cycling event is often the intensity of these droughts. And as we look at the drought of 11, 12, and 13, as well as moving into our current drought, we see that the percent of the area that is in what we would consider an exceptional drought is increasing. Of course, as we look at the entire area, we have close to 75% of the continental US that is under a drought right now. And so as we consider that, the estimated population in this area is over 90 million. So that's very intense. But as we look at just the drought ratings, it is important to consider what do these ratings actually mean. So as we look at what would be considered a mild drought or a D0 drought, this is where producers begin to supplement feeding for livestock. The chance of grass fires increase, our surface water levels decline. But as we move down into extreme and exceptional droughts, we see that under an exceptional drought, we have widespread crop loss. We also have culling of livestock herds. We see impacts not just within crop production, but also seafood, forestry, and tourism. Extreme sensitivity to fire, widespread tree mortality. And so this is very devastating when we see increased acreage move into these extreme drought areas. This is an image on the right that is from our dryland wheat variety trial just west of Amarillo, Texas this past April. And as you can see, this was under extreme drought conditions, but what you don't see is that this actually failed. There was no grain production in this field. So that drought definitely impacts the crop productivity and exacerbates crop failure. And of course, looking at the region of drought, we do see that as we consider the area of wheat production in drought, 46% of our winter wheat production region is under drought. So that does have a national impact when we consider reduced wheat yields. And of course, as we consider the global effect of our global markets, there are those direct implications as well. So back to agricultural production and rural communities. Well, I really do see that this is a symbiotic system where all these layers are interconnected and directly impacted by drought. When we talk about agriculture, agriculture is important, of course, first and foremost for food security. As I have mentioned, agriculture is climate sensitive, and the climate does create instability within those systems. But agriculture production is directly tied to the markets. Regional markets drive the production demands. But we also often do not consider how the proximity to the markets not just impact the production, but even when we talk about the impacts of greenhouse gases and climate change, proximity to markets can also have a direct impact. When we talk about dairy production in the Texas High Plains, well, we are in a fairly isolated region. And so there are direct impacts when we look at the transportation requirement for transporting products across the US. And then, of course, these markets are directly tied to income levels as well as employment within the community. One of the things that we have seen with technology is that with every layer of technology, the farmer becomes more efficient, but that also does remove jobs at the farm level. And so it is important to consider that we have the regional markets so that we are not necessarily we can retain jobs at the community level, and we can have the advanced jobs at the community that are the higher paying jobs. And of course, these incomes directly impact the community. These help support municipal services, education, local healthcare. One of the things that we do see across the Southern Great Plains is that as the tax basis within municipal the municipal tax base declines, we see communities lose things like their local fire department. And so communities become more dependent on volunteer fire departments. And with that, you see, of course, an increased response time by those first responders. So just another layer to the tie directly back to agriculture. And of course, at that community level, when we have communities that are impacted by low employment opportunities, low income, we have a greater risk for poor lifestyle choices, less access to health care. And then because of that, we have greater federal investment in health care. And this all goes back to climate change. So it is very important that as we look at this conceptual framework, that first and foremost, we sustain that agricultural productivity. And as we look at this, this really does accentuate the value of the land grant systems research and extension programs. The land grant systems provide public investment in agricultural research that extends beyond the farm. We have a civic responsibility for the well-being of our communities. And this is really tied to the land grant mission, where we have teaching, we have research, and we have extension, which is service to the communities. We have the service that's through people like myself who are extension agronomists, but then we also have within all land grants, the family consumer science agents, as well as specialists who are working directly with the community. And it all does tie back to the income that is brought into our agricultural communities through agricultural production. And so this mission is still critical to ensure 21st century agricultural productivity and social stability in a changing climate. So as I mentioned in my introduction, I did believe that as we talk about the Texas High Plains, it is important, and the Southern Great Plains, it is important to also touch on the history. And if we don't really understand where we've come from, we're not going to really be able to make educated decisions as we move forward. And so as we move back actually to 1878, Powell, as he was moving across the United States, and mapping this region, he came to what he defined as the 100th meridian. And this 100th meridian is actually the point in the US where precipitation west of the 100th meridian is less than 20 inches, and precipitation east of the 100th meridian on average is greater than 20 inches. And Powell said that irrigation west of the 100th meridian, which at that time, this area was defined as the Great American Desert, irrigation would be necessary for farming. So of course, on one hand, we could look back to 1878 and say, well, that was definitely before irrigation in the Great Plains, but there were already successful irrigation systems in California, and of course, using canal systems across much of Europe. And so John Wesley Powell was definitely ahead of his time. He had the foresight to understand what the challenges would be with this climatic boundary. And it is amazing that before we had Landsat and before we had the ability to really quantify the meteorological changes in this region, they had an understanding of the challenges that people would face west of that 100th meridian line. And of course, when we talk about this 100th meridian, actually scooting back, we see that it's closer to the 98th meridian, where precipitation is less than the potential evapotranspiration. So as we go through this region marked with blue, we see that east of this line, the precipitation is greater than the crop water demand. However, it's actually west of this line that precipitation is less than the crop water demand. But even with this warning, by 1888, there were over 4 million acres in the plains that were filed for that were claimed under the Homestead Act. But again, due to episodic droughts that are naturally occurring, half of the population had actually left by 1892. But nevertheless, people did continue to come to the Southern Great Plains and continue to farm in this region. And so because of that, the USDA, which at the time recognized that there was going to be a challenge in producing the forage for all of these settlers, appointed William Briggs to come to the Southern Great Plains to work with Homer Shantz on determining the water uptake of plants. And in 1910, they published a document, the Water Up Requirement of Plants, Investigations in the Great Plains. And it is amazing what they were able to accomplish at that time. They created a series of field stations going up the Great Plains from Williston, North Dakota, south to Dalhart, Texas. And so when we look at this transect, one of the first things that's very impressive to see that they were able to recognize these natural climatic boundaries, and they understood the evaporation demands and the climate demands on water. So looking at this isoline map of the US, we see that in Williston, North Dakota, our Class A pan evaporation is about 50 inches. Whereas when we move down to Dalhart, Texas, we have an evaporation of 95 inches, meaning that a free body of water is going to lose 95 inches of water per year just due to those environmental extremes. And so with this, they were able then to determine, using weighing lysimeters, the water requirement of alfalfa across the Great Plains. And what they did see is that in Williston, North Dakota, they needed approximately 500 grams of water per gram of dry matter produced. However, moving to Dalhart, Texas, that requirement doubled. And so as they looked at this, they were able to work with producers on crop selection and forage selection to be better adapted to the regional limitations and help producers become successful in this region. So early research recognized the impact of limited forage production and the potential to settle the Great Plains. But as we moved into the 20th century, irrigation from the Ogallala Aquifer allowed producers to overcome high evapotranspiration demands and really build our 20th century communities. And so as we move forward, our challenge is going to be, how do we overcome a lack of irrigation? Currently, irrigation in this region is from the Ogallala Aquifer. This is an aquifer that actually underlies 8 states in the Great Plains. It is an unconfined aquifer from South Dakota all the way to the Texas High Plains. And what we see is that from the 1940s to the 1980s, there was an average water decline of approximately 10 feet per year, especially in these southern regions. And what we have seen is that in the southern regions, we now have saturated thicknesses that are at a level that are no longer able to sustain crop productivity. As we look at the expansion of irrigation in the high plains, during the 1940s, irrigation took off, and that was thanks to the centrifugal pump. And we saw this primarily being flood and furrow irrigation. This was highly labor intensive and did result in lots of jobs for the region. But because of high energy prices, conversion of erodible land to the CRP program, as well as declining well capacities, resulted in actually a decline in irrigated acreage in the 1970s. But by the 1980s, we saw improvements in irrigation technologies that improved crop water use efficiencies, as well as minimized the amount of runoff on land. And so producers were able to expand irrigation across a larger area. And this was, of course, the center pivot irrigation. But since the 1990s, we have continued to see a decline in irrigated acreage. And of course, this extends into present day as well. And this is because of the decline in our well capacities and the saturated thickness of the Ogallala Aquifer. So we thought that there would be plenty of irrigation. Now we know that we are not going to have the irrigation to sustain crop productivity moving forward. And there are, just like there are plenty of popular press stories about climate change, there are also those stories about When will the Great Plains actually run out of water? We are in a water crisis, and we are having to conduct research to not only improve the crop water use efficiency, which is the amount of production per unit of water applied, but also reevaluate our rain-fed or dry land systems. How should we manage water on limited acreage to improve the productivity of this water? So when we actually look at irrigated acreage, it's not, it's somewhat misleading just to look at the irrigated land, but really it's very helpful to look at the net increase in irrigated acreage. And what we see is that while we do have a high percentage of irrigated land in the Southern Great Plains, we also have a high decrease in, or we have a decrease in irrigated acreage in this region as well. And so if we do not have the irrigation capacity, then what? What are options for farmers in the Southern Great Plains? We really have to reevaluate how we are managing our irrigation capacity and concentrate our irrigated acreage. But because of that, we lose irrigated acreage. And then of course, there's an economic impact with that. And so we must better manage our dry land and rain-fed acres so that we can stabilize the economic viability of the region. Successful crop production is going to require strategic management of our water resources. And these research and extension efforts are ongoing. Excuse me. And so this really has presented an irrigation dilemma. Is it better for producers to spread water thin across a large area or concentrate water to maximize production? It becomes the question of more acreage versus greater yield on less acreage. And I was recently part of a research project with University de Castilla-La Mancha in Spain, the USDA ARS, as well as West Texas A&M University, evaluating center pivot irrigation effects to maximize yield and profitability in the Texas High Plains. And what we evaluated was at reduced irrigation capacities, we no longer are able to pre-irrigate. So now we have depleted soil moisture. And as we look at our current drought situation, we know that we have depleted soil moisture because of a lack of winter precipitation. Producers have historically been able to refill those soil moisture profiles with irrigation. But if you do not have the capacity to do that, that is no longer an option. So we had to evaluate how we could change the application and the concentration of the irrigation on acreage under center pivot irrigation to optimize productivity. And this really does become very challenging because our yield response to water is non-linear, and there's always going to be a consideration that must be made. So for example, looking at maximum productivity, if we are able to irrigate at 100% level, this would be equivalent to 7 gallons per minute per acre in the Texas High Plains based off of our crop water demand, which for a 120 acre center pivot, a producer would need approximately 840 gallon per minute well. So that does become a very large well. And as we've seen in recent years, most producers in this region are irrigating with several wells tied together with capacities less than 400 gallons per minute per acre. And so because of that, we see how that impacts the return on that land. And so if a producer only has 5.4 gallons per minute per acre, in order to maximize production, they are going to need to only irrigate 75% of that acreage. If a producer only has 3.8 gallons per minute per acre, they are only going to be able to irrigate 50% of that irrigated acreage to maximize or optimize the return on that land. And the question becomes then, what do we do with the remaining acreage? It is very hard to obtain solid funding for dry land research because of the risk associated with dry land research and the crop failure that is very common in dryland research. But moving forward, in order to stabilize the return on the acreage, the arable acreage, and the productivity of our farms, and in turn, the trickle-down impact to our rural communities, it is important that we no longer just focus on the irrigated acreage, but what are we doing with the remaining fraction of that acreage? And then, of course, as we look at our current drought, it's also our seasonal outlook. We have a lack of irrigation, and we have this drought that is going to magnify crop stress. And so, again, turning back to history, we can really see that there have been many efforts throughout time to focus on changes to crop productivity. There was a Soil Conservation Service conservationist who was located at the Dalhart and Amarillo field offices from 1934 to 1942. And at that time, he suggested that we needed a permanent remedy. We need an intermediate type of agriculture to use on marginal lands. And he did say that for this to be economical, the land must be used more intensively than ranching, but not monoculture grain production. Now, unfortunately, as we shifted to irrigated crop production, irrigation allowed us to successfully in some ways, economically, if we look at economics as successful, transition to monoculture crop production. But without irrigation, we have to shift back to what was once suggested after the Dust Bowl. We need a type of agriculture to use on marginal land. And so with that, that really does focus on the research that we are conducting in the Texas High Plains. We are conducting climate smart adaptive research to meet 21st century cropping challenges and ensure rural socioeconomic viability of the Texas High Plains. One of the large projects that I lead is actually forage sorghum production research, looking at not just hybrids that are adapted to this region, but also looking at the feed efficiency as well as harvest management of forage sorghums. This research has been funded by Texas Grain Sorghum Board as well as the U.S. Sorghum Checkoff Program. I'm also looking at improved Bermuda grass systems. And as we look at shifting our irrigated production so that we are concentrating irrigation on reduced acreage, how are we going to manage those rain-fed systems? Possibly they are limited irrigated. In collaboration with New Mexico State, we are looking at systems where we can concentrate water on irrigated forages, but then on the remaining acreage, possibly deficit irrigate and improve Bermuda grass alfalfa system so that we can stabilize grazing during drought periods. And this project is funded by the USDA ARS Aquifer Program. But in line with the intensification of agriculture, I'm part of a project that's led by a colleague in Lubbock, Katie Lewis. And this is sustainable agricultural intensification and enhancement through the utilization of regenerative agricultural management systems. And so as we look at intensive agriculture, this really does become a regenerative ag system. Our project goal is to intensify agricultural production in an environmentally sustainable manner that enhances the agronomic and economic and community resilience of the Southern Great Plains. We will achieve this by successfully demonstrating the benefits of integration of regenerative agricultural practices so that we can increase carbon sequestration, reduce greenhouse gases, hopefully mitigate climate change impacts, diversify producer income, as well as conserve our limited water and enhance rural communities. And so with this, the research is focusing on reduced tillage, crop rotations, cover cropping, and grazing. And this is to increase crop and livestock production resiliency and sustainability while reducing negative environmental impacts. And so this goes back to how can we intensively manage our system so that we are more sustainable and we reduce our impacts on the climate. while being able to sustain climate change. As I initially mentioned, we are seeing an influx in livestock in this region. The Texas High Plains is now part of one of the largest dairy sheds in. And so as we look at providing forage for the dairy industry, we also have to consider what is the impact on our soil as well as our water. And I am part of a large project that is funded by FFAR, where we are evaluating soil carbon sequestration and nitrous oxide emissions in dairy feed production systems. We are considering the environmental and agronomic outcomes of new manure-based fertilizer systems and hoping to achieve soil health and water benefits. And this is, as I mentioned, a large project, and we are part of a large dairy and research research partner network. These 4 key dairy sheds actually are responsible for 80% of the US milk production. And so this is just another example of the research that we are conducting that is climate smart, so that we can hopefully be sustainable in light of climate change. So as we consider the research we are conducting, as we consider the history of crop production in the Texas High Plains and settlement across the Southern Great Plains, it is important that we actually consider what are our future opportunities. And while I initially spoke about the challenges that are associated with climate change, I do think it's important to point out that we have opportunities because of climate change. We have opportunities to ensure that we can sustain and improve feed and forage availability for livestock. We can provide technical jobs for highly skilled labor, as well as stabilize our rural communities. We can improve the economic prospects for agriculture. We can lower the environmental impact of agriculture. We can increase food security and availability of fresh produce and reduce the impacts of regional food deserts. And then this is important to consider the national, or it is important to consider the national value. All of these opportunities will help increase food security. They will also help with regional economic stability, as well as minimize dependence on federal programs. And as we look at the next farm bill that's moving forward, it is important that as we consider our research and extension, that we do consider the value to these activities on these federal programs, and especially mitigating crop risk and mitigating farmer dependence on crop insurance programs. So with that, I will take any questions. I think that we are just about out of time for presentation.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bell. I did my PhD research in the Great Plains, and I think you just very elegantly outlined some of the dynamics of that region. We do have a couple questions here. So I'll go ahead and start with one that is related to the migration map that you showed early on across the country. The question comes from Addie. She said, what does the demographic breakdown look like for emigration from rural communities? Are there any trends with age, gender, ethnicity, or other factors?
Yes, that is a great question. And as I considered the migration, that was something that I did look at. And of course, for the scale and scope of this presentation, I did not include any of that information. But of course, when we look at age as a whole, we know that we are looking at a rural population that is aging. Moving into the next several years, there's discussion that the majority of the population, or there will be a greater percent of the population over 65 than under the age of 18. And as a whole, most of our farmers are over the age of 50. And so that really does become a very important consideration. Also, when we look at just demographics, we do see that, especially in the Southern Great Plains, that a large percent of the population is Hispanic, and also where we do see an increase in population for industry, those are often immigrants that are associated with packing plants and the livestock industry. And so it is important that as we consider not just, again, the impact to improve, or the research and extension efforts to improve crop productivity at the farm level, but what are our outreach efforts within those immigrant populations, and how are we serving those at the community level? And of course, as we look at school systems and and that infrastructure, we have this interconnected web that's all tied together.
Thank you. Just as a reminder, feel free to add your questions into the Q&A function, and we'll go through as many as we can here in the last 10 minutes of this session. The next question is related to organic production systems. Has there been any discussion on utilizing organic production systems in the research that you're doing with regenerative systems or climate smart adaptive systems in the Southern High Plains?
Definitely, that's a great question. And of course, there's questions from producers about organic systems, and we have conducted some organic research within Texas A&M AgriLife. The project that I am part of, and I will back up to this slide, with Soil Health Institute and Dairy Management Institute, does include an organic component. And the dairy that we are working on in the Texas High Plains is an organic dairy. And so we are actually looking at cover crops, tillage, as well as manure management in that organic system. And of course, one of the things that we have to consider is, how does tillage impact that? How can we manage those cover crops? And what does that do to the greenhouse gas fluxes? But also, because we are in a water limited environment, and soil water is so critical to crop success, how does tillage impact the soil water flux and often the crop water availability? So definitely a very dynamic system, and I do think that it is important that we consider organic production in these systems as well.
Thank you. So our next question here also relates a bit to migration. Do you think that as the dairy industry in the Texas Panhandle runs out of water in the western Texas Panhandle, that they will migrate east to areas like Hemphill County to utilize the water resources there? And perhaps this is also considering topography and soil is not as favorable there as it is in the Western Panhandle. Any thoughts on that type of migration?
That's a very important question, and I know one that is being seriously considered and evaluated by people across the whole Southern Great Plains. As we look at the dairy industry as a whole, over the last 20 years, we have seen a big influx into this region from other regions, which does indicate that, on one hand, that the dairy industry is very mobile, and that the dairy industry is moving in response to either environmental limitations or resource limitations in other regions. So one could assume that, as climate change and aquifer levels impact forage production and dairy production in this region, that the dairy industry would move it to other regions as well. This is a very roundabout way to answer this, but what we are also seeing is that we have a influx in dairy industry related or the infrastructure, the milk processing plants, the cheese plants. And so as we see this investment currently within the Southern and Western Texas High Plains, how will we see that shift? So time will tell. I probably shouldn't be speculating. It's a more of a speculative, but the dairy industry, yes, has shifted. So they may shift again.
So I'll ask one more dairy question that came through, knowing you are an agronomist, but with a very solid grasp on this region and the agricultural trends here. But another question came in is, how is the growing dairy industry sustainable in the region, considering the water that's needed for feed crops and animals?
That's a very valid question. And so that is why I did point out that as we look at the demand for forage and with this growing dairy industry, will we see a displacement of other crops? And so if we look at producers producing forages rather than cotton, wheat for grain, sorghum for grain, corn for grain, how will we see a shift in these traditional crops? And it's not just at the farm level, but then what is happening within the broader, what happens to the broader infrastructure, grain storage. Of course, this region, we have to rail in a lot of feed grain anyway. We only produce probably 30% of the livestock demand. But nevertheless, will we see an impact within the trucking industry as well as other industries if we see a greater shift to forage production?
Thank you. Another question came in about rotating crops specifically, but maybe you could answer this more broadly, but could you talk a little bit more about how some of these management practices that are being adopted, like rotating crops, help to conserve water in this region?
Right. So as we look at crop rotation, of course, there's lots of benefits to crop rotation, but really coupling crop rotation with reduced tillage is very important for soil water conservation. Residue management is very critical because while we talk about the benefit for cover crops, providing that armor for the soil, in semi-arid regions, the residue provides much of those same benefits. That residue provides the blanket for the soil, minimizes evaporative losses from the soil, minimizes increases in soil temperature, as well as crusting of the soil that results in runoff. So when we have residue from a crop in a rotation, we have usually increased infiltration, we have reduced evaporation, and ultimately greater water available for crop production. So crop rotations are very critical. Of course, as we look at rotations in this region, and as we shift from irrigated to dry land systems, one of the questions does become, how are we managing that fallow period? And of course, back to cover crops, there's always the discussion about the benefit of a live cover, the benefit of that live root. But during drought periods, when you do not have the moisture to replenish those soil water profiles, that live crop can be using water at the expense of the next crop. Now, again, there does become, it becomes a farm by farm decision because a producer does have to weigh the benefits of the improved infiltration and those benefits during a normal year. But there's always caveats and challenges within every crop production system.
A related question here, thinking about the farmers and family farmers or farming families, maybe so I'll go back to the migration again in this area and thinking about the number of individuals who are there, who are doing this work. Is there anything else that you could add related to the socioeconomic factors in this area? I think I'm interpreting this question.
Right. So as we consider the broader impact, and of course, as a research and extension agronomist, the focus of my activities is on improving production at the farm level. But what we do see, back to the socioeconomic impact to the community, is that as incomes are reduced at the farm level, farmers have less money to spend within their community. There's less money spent on equipment. We regularly see equipment dealers closing across the Southern Great Plains. We're seeing auto dealerships close across the Southern Great Plains. Cafes and local businesses in communities close across the Southern Great Plains. And we like to think that there is, this trickle down economic impact, but as we become and with climate change, and as crop productivity becomes limited, it becomes more of a funnel effect. We see that much of that income is retained at the farm level, and there's less income now going down to the community. And of course, that affects, as I mentioned, the businesses in the community, and then of course the employment and the people they can hire. Now we've affected the tax base in the community. We have seen consolidation of schools in these rural communities, or across rural communities. We've seen hospitals in these rural communities close. And in many cases, as I mentioned, food deserts. There are many communities that do not have a grocery store. And so if we think about people within communities who are elderly, who do not have the ability to drive to a neighboring community to go to the grocery store, they are often dependent on food pantries within their local churches. And so indirectly, this all goes back to crop productivity in an agricultural economy. We have to have the crop productivity to maintain the economic viability of the farm, but also all of the jobs and the businesses within those communities that support that region. And so it really does become a very circular system that is symbiotically tied together. And one of the things I didn't mention when I talk about the history, but I really do keep at the forefront of my mind, and especially as I was thinking about John Wesley Powell, and in 1878, he's making this trek across the Great Plains and comes to the 100th meridian. Well, that seems like that was so long ago, but that was only 140 years ago. And during this brief duration, we have exploited the Ogallala Aquifer, but with that, we have seen the rise of these communities, and irrigation allowed people to expand and to grow these communities. And in many ways, that was the right decision for that time. And of course, they did not have the knowledge or the foresight to know that that was an unlimited, or was not an unlimited water supply. In the north and areas of South Dakota and Nebraska, the aquifer does recharge. But as we move into the southern Great Plains, our depth to water is 400 feet, if not deeper. So we are extracting water at a greater rate than the aquifer could ever recharge. And so we built those communities with that infrastructure, with the irrigated infrastructure and the ability with irrigation to expand our livestock industry. But as this declines, we do have to refocus. How are we going to better manage? And it goes back to the intensive agricultural systems, but regenerative systems, how we can be holistic in our management and our approaches so that we sustain not just the farm, but also our rural communities. And that really does go back to what I initially mentioned, the value of all of our land grant systems. And I do recognize that this is not just a problem within the Southern Great Plains. This is a national problem. But fortunately, we have land grants across the US that are addressing these challenges within each of their states. And so it does become critical that we look at these challenges as opportunities, and what can we collectively do to ensure the productivity of agriculture, of course, for food security, for national security, but also for rural community sustainability, as well as mitigating our dependence, the community dependence on state and federal programs.
I think that last question was a perfect way to end. I know we've reached the end of our time here, but thank you so much, Dr. Bell, for taking the time to be here today. This was a wonderful presentation. And if you are interested in sharing the recording or going back and watching any part of this, you can find it on ncfar.org. And I think this will also probably be shared with the people who registered. So thank you all again, and have a wonderful day.
Well, thank you again for the opportunity. And I really am honored that this topic was selected.